got the Amen Clinics from Electa, the Gamma Knife headquarters in America, and it's day 4, our final day. No scans, but today we're going to get all the reports, all the feedback, all the images from the scans, and get the whole detailed plan of how to change our brains moving forward. And then we are out to Salt Lake City.
I'm Dr. Munir Ali. We're about to do the initial psychiatric evaluation. So this is the part where we go over everything we found, all the data, the scans, cognitive testing, and we talk a little bit about sort of the history and how it all comes together.
You excited?
Ready.
I'm excited.
Well, what form of ketones did you guys take?
Like exogenous ketones.
Yeah.
He took a free acid formula that was a lot faster absorbing.
Mm-hmm.
We both took the one that's like the identical one that your body naturally produces. So I took a salt-based one. He took a free acid-based one.
Okay. When you guys take it, what is it? Is it a noticeable benefit for you in terms of? Ooh. Nice catch.
Yeah, it's definitely like cognitive.
Yeah.
Cognitive focus, alertness for me.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd say for me, and one of the reasons why I'm interested in all this is because I don't get a stimulation from caffeine or anything like that, and so I just drink decaf now.
Yeah.
But with the exogenous ketones, I don't get like this crazy like hype that everyone talks about with like energy and like this boost or anything. And then I've talked with Ryan, other people, I'm like, am I just the work I've been doing with my overall health? Am I just high functioning to the norm of where I was and where most people are? So I'm not getting this crazy significant difference, or is there something going on in my body to where
We're going to talk about it.
Yeah.
It's actually it's because I'll show you in the scan, but it's because you have ADD.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's what I was diagnosed when I was younger.
Yeah.
With. My friend Dave, his daughter is high functioning autistic.
Yeah.
And so they've been learning a lot about how this works. He's like, that's why you can do the crazy shit you do on your bike.
100%.
Because your mind can focus on so many things, but it's also why it's difficult for me to read.
Yeah.
And like do so like normal things.
Got a bank with 6 zeros you will really enjoy. I have this crazy ass vision you would love to destroy. I got a head full of money, I don't ever withdraw. I got this plot on all these artists that they may use and saw. Scary pictures like the ghosts they seen was writing a
So
lot.
if you looked at Eamon's book on the 7 types of ADD, you're classic. You're classic in the sense that like you're actually like best case scenario, meaning like you've taken seriously no, you've taken advantage, like the stuff that you've made into a professional career. People with ADD, usually it's just like a really good hobby, but they're like struggling to like do some kind of a desk job. But you've been able to take that and morph it into like your livelihood, right? So it's like
I love to learn now, but like yeah. Like,
and it's no different than when I see guys that I've seen the whole spectrum, like guys that race cars. I've seen like high-profile lawyers in the courtroom. They're all really good at what they do in the moment. They think quicker than most people. Their reaction time is faster. They can take in a lot of inputs all at the same time, and they're fantastic at what they do in those moments. And people will say stuff like, "I don't even know how you did that. Like, you know, you did something most people couldn't do." And it's the same reason ADD kids love video games. There's like 10 things happening at the same time. Most other people would look at that and be like, I have no idea what's even happening. But they're like winning the game, right?
would that have something to do with why like if it's just silent, I feel fidgety and like just weird, but if like I sleep with noise, if it's constant,
Absolutely.
if there's no ups and downs,
I'd expect you'd have trouble with sleep. You'd feel restless, and
I'll
you
say
you
we have a
mentioned that
sound
kind of deep
box
sleep.
by our bed, and like,
Yeah.
like I'll put on like thunderstorms because Jackie's like, oh, I can do that, but like a static white noise, like I'll fall asleep
It's
right
good
to
for
it.
you.
Gary Vee is someone I've been relating to a lot because he's like, I'm the same way. Like I need chaos makes me feel calm.
So I'll explain it when we look at the brain. It's interesting, but that prefrontal cortex, it's ADD. When you think about how it lives in the brain, it's the ventromedial prefrontal cortex on the bottom, and it's an understimulated prefrontal cortex, and that's why we use stimulants to boost dopamine, norepinephrine. And what if you didn't have ADD, it'd make you feel all geeked up and wired. But if you have ADD, it just makes you feel balanced.
Okay.
And so you're sensory stimulation seeking naturally. And so when you're in a situation where you have a lot of sensory input and you're stimulated really well, you're in a balanced state. You're more calm and level-headed than
makes
ever.
so much sense. The
Like-
why I get weird if I don't ride, and like
Oh yeah.
that's something I've been curious about is like that adrenaline rush for over 15 years of my life. Like, is that why it's hard for me not to ride? If I'm like, I'm not gonna ride for a month, it's like 2 weeks. I'm like,
So it's not going to hurt you in the long run, and people think of it as the adrenaline rush, but really you're just like you're always looking for that balanced state. So my whole thing is, if you live your life like that, you'll be really good at things like BMX, but you could find yourself just being bored in every other situation. The key for me are 2 things. People, when I start talking about treating it and balancing that all the time, right away people say, well, hold on, am I going to be just as good as I was at all those other things? And you still will be, especially if you're old enough and it's like a learned skill. But the key is that you just feel balanced and you're not looking for it. Like you're not chasing after it. Like you're itching to do it all the time. That's going to be one of the big take homes for you.
Yeah.
Besides sleep.
Yeah.
You're
That's why we're here.
And for you, Ryan, we're going to talk a lot about stress. Like stress and the emotional circuitry.
That sounds right.
These are two norms, right? I'm going to walk you through this. These are just examples, just to kind of orient you. CAT scans, MRIs, like I said, they're structural, right? So we look at a CAT scan MRI, it's going to be a physical picture of the actual brain, like we mentioned. SPECT, like we talked about before, RCBF, regional cerebral blood flow. So these pictures we're looking at are 3D computer models, right? It's actually a computational model of your brain activity based on the blood flow. Right? So those 4 views are the same 4 we're looking at here. The difference between these two, the surface scan, the rainbow color doesn't mean anything. It's set to rainbow just so we notice the shape. Right, so we're really paying attention to contour here. In the healthy example, this is 90% or more blood flow to all parts. Right, so that's just generally considered a healthy cortex. When you start dropping below 90%, that's where the computer will generate that part of the brain looking like a lumpy, bumpy area. So you start to see decreases. And when it's 45% or less, it's a hole. Eamon tends to show the most dramatic examples like Swiss cheese brains and like you saw the NFL football players, right? Worst scans you've ever seen. All those guys had, just like you, like 20 CAT scans, MRIs, all within normal limits, right? And very first SPECT image Eamon did, it was like 160 NFL players that he had in the study. They were all global severe damage, right? No surprise to us, we knew that coming into it because people all over the world, the most common use of SPECT imaging that correlates with what we do across the world is using the surface scan, this same rainbow colored scan, to look at blood flow changes as it relates to things like TBI, traumatic brain injury. So Eamon's work, no surprise, just correlated with everybody else's, just showing global severe damage. The areas most commonly affected are frontotemporal, right? So all those football players qualified for like that cognitive deficits related to frontotemporal damage to the point where they almost bordered like frontotemporal dementia, right? So that's what the surface shows. Physical damage, of course, for you, we're going to talk about changes as it relates to the tumors, and for both of you, physical head injuries, but for you, a lot more.
Yeah.
Right?
Was it on the notes too? Dave Mira, are you familiar with him?
Yeah.
So he was diagnosed with CTE after he took his life.
I saw that, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's what I'm trying to do, a lot of this to get into the BMX community.
The brain is soft and squishy like butter, right? It keeps it really simple. The skull is hard like a rock, right?
Yeah.
And so when you think about your brain sitting inside every nook and cranny of the skull, the area packed in the tightest are your temporal poles, right? So your temporal lobes wrap around the side and come to these 2 poles, and those poles sit packed in this housing really tight. And so anytime you have physical injury to the brain, and helmets doesn't really matter, right? Because it's about acceleration, deceleration forces, right? So that brain's going to rattle around inside the skull, and the temporal poles are going to take the biggest hits front to back. And so it's often a good sensitive indicator. It's the very first place I'll start to see changes in a scan. These are really sensitive scans. I mean, if I just see, you've been through quite a bit, but if I just see like high school athletes and they've taken, I've seen like everything you could think of. People think football, of course, and hockey, but I've seen a lot of cheerleaders. I've seen like things that you don't think of because the tumble accidents, right? Yeah. They'll show signs. The good news when I see kids, especially in their teens, is even if I see it on the scan, even if they have post-concussive symptoms, they have so much neuroplasticity happening at that age, right? Kind of right through age 26, where the prefrontal cortex is like more fully formed. It's the last part of the brain to fully form, right? In terms of like neuronal growth. And so there's a lot of hope that like it's not really that concerning. When I see people having a lot of head injuries and they're living the hard and fast life into their 30s and 40s, that's a problem because the neuroplasticity slows it down. And if you continue to live that kind of life, as you get older, it's concerning, and you want to do more to be more proactive about healing. Whereas kids, they can get damaged, and as long as they're living a pretty clean life, not drinking and drugging, they're going to heal up pretty quick. Right. Eamon said we can't stop there because the emotional circuitry that we care about in psychiatry related to the cingulate, basal ganglia, deep limbic, and temporal, those are the other 4 he always talks about, they sit nestled in the center. And so we have to look past the surface, which is called the neocortex, into the center of the brain, and that's what the active view allows us to see. And so when you look at this, you have to sort of think about, sort of imagine you're looking right through the surface into the middle, and the color gradient is important on this one. So the blue is set to 50% tracer uptake, the red is set to 85%, and the white is set to 95%. So the easy way to think about it, blue is sort of average activity, red is active and white's super active, like white hot. What Eamon found over all these, 30 years and all these scans, no surprise, is that the cerebellum's always kicking nice and red and white hot. Up to 50% of your brain cells are packed in just these two areas. Right? Mm-hmm. So anatomically, that's pretty amazing. It's just these two areas are so dense. The rest of the brain shares the other 50%. It's like the brain of the brain. And all the research, people used to think motor coordination and movement when it comes to the cerebellum. Then most recent research showed that the cerebellum actually only has about 20% of its resources dedicated to movement. And the cortex also has about 20%. So there's a complete misconception that it's like cerebellum is just tied to movement, because the rest of the brain shares the other 50%, also has the same amount of space dedicated to it. What they talk about the cerebellum being now is more like the brain of the brain, and kind of like a CPU if you think about a computer. So no surprise, it's always running red and white. It's supposed to. If I see damage to the prefrontal cortex, interestingly, or ADD, that itself can make this look lower than it's supposed to look. It's called cross-diaschisis. It's this whole concept of how damage to one part of the brain can actually refer low activity to the other. And if you look at the actual circuitry, the way things are wired, it's complicated, but there's cross tracks this way and this way. So we'll talk about that a bit. And then this is where, like I said, blue is considered pretty average. Little bits of red are considered normal, but when you see too much red in any one system, it's overactivity. You see white hot in that system, it's like really beyond the normal limits. And that was the basis of Eamon's ideas when it came to like obsessive compulsive tendencies, right? Oppositional argumentative behavior, baseline anxiety, being sensitive to criticism, easily embarrassed, right? Nervousness, low energy depression, and then temporals, which is like mood instability and anger and stuff like that. So Ryan, this was yours. And the big difference between these reports is like this first paragraph here at the top, the number one. It's going to say like compared to this scan, the baseline scan. Gosh, this is the same thing for you here. That's the report. Cool. So, and then these ones they marked with keto concentration because it was under a concentration state. And these were your concentration scans. Concentration and concentration. So I'm going to lay these over your previous baseline because it's like comparing concentration
versus concentration,
exactly. So we've never, I don't know how much Gigi told you, we never actually have looked at keto specifically. Eamon's looked at a bunch of different things over the years. This was concentration. Yeah. The CPT, so this is also where I wanted to show you your CPTs. You guys both did the X test twice, right?
Yes.
So when we look at these, so the CPT, Connor's continuous performance test, it's what we use to keep somebody in a concentration state. And Eamon picked it because he's like, why not use an ADD test at the same time? It's actually a validated tool to test for ADD, right? So when you look at this, the packet actually goes through each of these tests individually. Oh, cool. This is the summary page, overview. So I'm just showing you the overview. It shows you on a sort of a bar graph, and then it breaks it down by each of these tests here, the measures, and what your actual T-score was, which is graphed here, and then what that falls into, like average or low, right? But this is the big summary at the bottom. The summary in concentration task, that's what I was saying at baseline for you, Ryan, you're not coming up atypical, right? Mm-hmm. They don't suggest ADD. When you were on the ketones, you were actually faster. Mm. So there was it was a cognitive enhancement. So that's what it says, relative to the normal sample, your response was faster. For you, Josh, at baseline, you do have a suggestion of ADHD. And that's what this
I have
describes.
A lot more writing in that one than this one.
And then, so that's basically, it's showing you kind of on the bar graph, you kind of want to see things. You see, like, generally you could say, like, the levels that are high here, you want to see them, like, lower, like, faster response time.
Got it.
So here you're, like, a little bit better than you were without. And that's why it says you were faster this time. Same thing with you here. See how much higher these are? Mm-hmm. And that's, you do correlate with ADD, especially in specific measures. And here you're a lot lower, and it says specifically, you're what looked like ADD here actually kind of normalized. Mm. So you have a faster response, kind of like he did. That's actually cool to see.
Yeah.
So this
makes me feel better because although I don't feel like this crazy cognitive boost everyone talks about, it's like it's doing something,
which is actually really cool. So
I don't think I'm just wasting my money and time by using them.
And this is a validated scale, right? Connor's continuous performance test. Like this is what we use for diagnostic ADHD. So you could say here you fell into like the range for indications of ADHD, and on the ketones you didn't, which is really cool. So
that's sweet.
Yeah, you can even just keep it with your scan reports.
Thank you.
When it comes down to the actual scans, when we think about the ketones versus the concentration, both of your processing circuitry, the emotional processing, looked better. So as much as this was like overactive, it actually quieted down, and that's one of the main things that the report mentions on the ketones. And for you, even though it wasn't even that hot to begin with, it came down even a little bit more, which was good. When we think about the surface scan, some areas for you got better, but the prefrontal, interestingly for both of you, got a little bit more lower in terms of like functioning. I don't know why that is, but the prefrontal is the one area mostly dedicated to focus, attention, memory, and that's why I showed you the CPT first, because if anything, that CPT is pushing the limits of this. And the ketones, I don't know if just the process and the way that it's affecting the brain is pulling more resources from the prefrontal cortex, and that's why it looks lower. But your blood flow measures were actually lower for both of you. That's what it says in your reports even, comparing this concentration to the ketone concentration. But your generalized blood flow to the other parts of the brain, for you it remained the same. It already looked pretty good. And for you it got a little bit better. So some of these areas here you can notice
that's the first thing I noticed.
aren't as prominent. So that's really cool. But I have no like specific explanation as to why. Like again, Eamon's never looked at ketones resting versus or one versus the other, but I'd be curious to ask him and what he thought about it. Overall performance, clearly it was improved, but seeing lower activity here doesn't necessarily mean a bad thing. I don't know if that's something that over time would positively affect the prefrontal, even though it looks lower in real time, or negatively affect it. I don't know.
This one looks more full too than this one.
Yeah, so
not
that's
even just those two areas, but just
exactly. So you can't even fully appreciate it in the 3D scan. So the 3D scan is actually for your benefit, for me to show you. But again, they look at it in slices.
Yeah.
And so the reader who actually looked at the specific slices, that's the report they typed up.
Yeah.
That's why I gave that to you, where it says compared to the scan on April 5th. That's where it lays out the details, where it specifically mentions for both of you that all of the emotional circuitry got better. It talks about the cingulate, basal ganglia, temporal. All of it looks much more improved, which is really cool, because I didn't expect to see that. I expected to see more blood flow to the surface and no change here. And we actually saw a lot of decrease here, which is the part that can make you overthink and can make you stressed out. But we saw, surprisingly, actually lower activity in the prefrontal. So, yeah, this is a pilot study, 2 guys, N of 2.
N of 2. I'll have to get more in here.
Yeah, so that's really cool. I was excited to see the CPT, because that's like we're pioneers for brain imaging. We've done this for like 30 years, and we've seen a lot of surprising things. Eamon's kind of figured it out as he's went along. But the CPT is something people use all over the country to look at ADHD markers. So that's really cool.
I actually thought I did worse on the one yesterday, because like when he was changing my thing, like I remember I hit like 2 X's in a row, because I was like, he was like moving around the needle.
It distracted you for a second.
I was like, oh shit. But
No, you actually did better.
that's crazy.
Yeah. It's interesting that for both of you, what it noted was, because that test, that's why there's a whole report. Some of the things are testing your variability, like how many mistakes you made or how much variability there was in your responses. Like, were you able to sustain your performance, or did your performance actually vary?
Right.
And that wasn't a big deal, but the interesting thing for both of you is that it was faster. So your responses the first time weren't in the range of ADD. The second time they still weren't, but you were faster in your response time. That's really cool. Yeah. So yeah, a lot of data.
I love it.
It's really cool, right? So I'm really glad you guys did record this. Most people just record an audio recording, but even better that it's video, because you can go through and kind
3
of
different
rehash
cameras.
this.
Yeah.
We just got the intense evaluation of all the scans and all the feedback, and we're all really surprised, and it gave a lot of clarity onto a lot of things that I've been experiencing and a lot of questions I had, and it proved a lot of things that I assumed. It proved them right, and so it's really interesting. And then Ryan had a bunch of great results as well, and we just learned a lot about why we do what we do and we're the way we are, and more importantly, get a plan to implement moving forward to make some changes and see how it goes.